Following the Second World War, there were many Nazi war criminals who were condemned to death, but many of them were executed in public in front of large crowds. Following the liberation of Stutthof concentration camp, former guards including a number of women were brought in front of 200,000 people and were executed on a huge gallows. But there were other acts of reprisal carried out after different German-occupied areas were liberated, and one man who met a brutal end was a Nazi commandant of a transit labour camp in Poland, Adolf Wilhelms. His image is a brutal one, and his execution shows him standing above his grave. But what is the story of his execution? Join us today as we look at this, and remember as always to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Throughout the Second World War, the Nazis would use transit camps where prisoners were held for a brief period and were detained before they were deported to concentration camps. The Nazis would at the start of the Second World War invade many different countries and lands, and whilst they were there they would implement their brutal policies towards the population, and would establish transit camps as a way of holding people and interrogating them, before ultimately sending them to their deaths. The conditions inside of the transit camps were similar to concentration camps. They were terrible and overcrowded, and there was poor sanitation. Many died inside the camps awaiting their transport, and they were set up all over occupied Europe. But not all transit camps were run by the SS. Some were also run by the Wehrmacht and by local collaborators who worked with the Nazis. For example, Drancy camp in France near to Paris was staffed by collaborators. But there were forced labour camps also where workers were made to work very hard and conduct brutal backbreaking work. Some prisoners were made to produce supplies for the German war effort and the economy, and the conditions in these forced labour camps were also brutal and barbaric. Prisoners had insufficient food, equipment and medicine. They were not given appropriate clothing for the time of year. There was no rest for them, and they were forced to work all year round, and the death rates inside of the labour camps was very high. Little is known about Adolf Wilhelms, but he was the commandant of a transit labour camp, and it was his job to ensure the imprisonment of prisoners inside of a Bayer factory in Poland. It is known that he was a man who was in charge of the Bayer factory near to Lodz, and this was a company that became part of IG Farben, a chemical conglomerate that would be involved in producing drugs that would be injected into prisoners inside the concentration camps. They would also pass chemicals to doctors, who then caused a huge amount of suffering inside camps such as Buchenwald, Dachau and Auschwitz. The factory that Wilhelms oversaw was brutal and the conditions there were shocking, and the prisoners who were forced to work there worked incredibly hard. For this, Wilhelms got a reputation for being a brutal commandant. The town of Lodz, near to where Adolf Wilhelms worked, suffered greatly during the Second World War, and a large ghetto was set up there, and inside of this were 163,000 residents, but it's believed that only around 10,000 Jews of Lodz lived to see out the end of the war, and many more people were sent there, as it was believed there were 210,000 victims of the ghetto. The people inside the ghetto would be forced to work 12-hour days, inside of brutal factories and establishments, and it was inside one of these factories that Adolf Wilhelms would oversee the work forces. The guards would impose brutal sanctions also for those who were considered rule breakers, but Adolf Wilhelms became known for being an executioner. At the end of the Second World War he was captured. In the city of Lodz, he was brought in front of a huge crowd made up of men, women and also children, and he was guarded by a number of Polish officials. Some interestingly had German weapons, and they would oversee his final moments. He was stood above his grave and was paraded in front of the civilian population, holding a sign saying, "I was the executioner of Poles at the Bayer factory in 1939. It's assumed that he was shot by a firing squad shortly after, in front of the crowd. The image of Adolf Wilhelms in his final moments is haunting. It was in a sense revenge for what the Germans did to the Polish population. They would carry out executions in a similar manner, in which placards were used to tell people the crimes that people committed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.